Hello, welcome to another edition of Theology Thursday. We all have favorite Bible characters. Of course, Jesus will be everyone's favorite character, but there are other people that we really like. Peter always seems to be a popular one because people identify with his foibles and failures, and yet he had a heart that still wanted to serve the Lord. Other people like David or Abraham or Sarah, whoever it happens to be. Um, my favorite Bible character is Jeremiah. But second behind Jeremiah would be Esther. I have a great admiration for Esther. Caleb's another one I like, but I like a lot of them I like, but Jeremiah and Esther stand at the top of the list. And so today I want to talk about this person, Esther. And there's a book named after her called, the Book of Esther. So I want to see if I can help us understand the book of Esther. And there are a few things that do make the book unique that we'll talk about here in just a minute. So Esther, the entire book is one story related to one particular event, but there are several other events that tie into it. So let me just give the brief summary. We have a queen named Vashti, and the king, Ahasuerus, who probably was Xerxes the first, even though we're not 100% certain, because Persian words are different than Hebrew words. So we have Ahasuerus the king, and he's hanging out with some of his buddies, and he wants Vashti to come and to show off her beauty. And there's some question as to whether or not this would have involved commanding her to do a striptease or something. We don't know for certain. It's a very pagan culture. But regardless of whatever the specifics were, she refused. And so the king gets pretty upset, asks his advisors. Advisors are like, look, if you don't do something, every woman in this kingdom is going to rebel against her husband. Man, you need to get them in line. And again, these are pagans, so this is not something that God is endorsing, though he will use it to accomplish his purpose. And so Vashti is deposed as queen and basically sent off in exile to a palace, and that's where she'll spend the rest of her days. Well, now we need a new queen to replace Vashti. Now, there is a harem, but she's like at the top. We would use the word queen. And so a search begins. In the meantime, there's a man named Mordecai who works at the palace, and there's a man named Haman who's a very powerful general and very close to the king. And so this guy Haman, who's close to the king, very powerful, wants everybody to bow down before him. He really wants to be, a big shot. And Mordecai refuses. Mordecai's Jewish. His family went there during the exile in 586 BC when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. And now the Persians have taken over the Babylonian Empire. And so they've inherited all of these slaves. And so Mordecai's working there, refused. So Haman is furious, and he gets the king to make an order that on a particular day throughout their kingdom, people can kill Jews. He just wants to get rid of them because he wants to get rid of Mordecai in particular. And so while all of that's happening, there's a beauty contest, and Mordecai's niece named Hadassah, even though her Persian name is going to be Esther, and so we know her as Esther, Esther is selected as queen. She's a very beautiful young lady, and so God uses her beauty to accomplish his purpose. So Mordecai goes to Esther and says, hey, the king has made this pronouncement. Would you go to him and ask him to fix it? And she says, well, I can't do that, and I'll explain why in a minute. But anyway, she goes to the king, eventually tells him what's going on. Because of Persian law, the king cannot rescind a previous statement. So he writes a new statement that the Jews can defend themselves. Well, Haman kind of gets word of this and gets worried. So Haman goes in, and Esther's sitting, kind of reclining on a couch like queens would do, and falls on her, begging her to rescue him, essentially. The king comes in and thinks that Haman is assaulting her and has Haman executed. And he says, is there a way to do this quickly? And he said, well, he just built some gallows for a guy named Mordecai. And the king said, okay, hang him on the gallows. In the meantime, Mordecai has uncovered a plot to assassinate the king, has given that information to the king, and Mordecai is elevated to a place of prominence. So it's all a lot of intrigue, and it's a really fascinating story through all of that. And so there are in the book of Esther then 5 key characters that compose the book. And you remember with your 5 fingers, and so I'm going to use those to help you. And by the way, I do this with children and with my seminary students. So it's good from young all the way to old to help us remember the story of Esther and the 5 characters. The first character is number 1. That's the number 1 finger, and that's Ahasuerus the king. He's the number 1 guy. He is the king. Next is the thumb, and that's Mordecai. Man, Mordecai's an all right guy. He loves the Lord. He's faithful to him. He's faithful to the king, even though he's a slave in the kingdom. He still does what is right. So we have Mordecai, the king. Then we have the no-no finger, the not good finger, the bad finger, and that is Haman. He's a bad person. He's a wicked person. And so we have Mordecai, Ahasuerus, Haman. Then we have Vashti. This finger, you can move all your fingers independently. This one always seems to not be able to do a lot by itself. It's the hardest finger to control independently. And the king could not control Vashti. She refused to come and dance before them, and so that's Vashti. And then the last one is dainty little Esther, our Pinky, the woman that God uses. And so those are the 5 key characters of the book of Esther. Now, I want to talk just very briefly about a couple of passages, and then I want to give some theological teachings from the book of Esther. In chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, we run in to this statement. So we need to understand the background. In the ancient world, the king is sitting on his throne in his throne room, and you've been invited to come and see the king, or you've made a request and he has approved, then you would come in at your appointed time and conduct your business or whatever it is, and you're done. However, if you walked into the throne room uninvited, the king had 2 options. Option 1 was just to ignore you, in which case the guards would take you from the throne room and would execute you. If, however, the king extended the scepter, he pointed it at you, then, even though you did not have an appointment, you're allowed to come in and do whatever it is that you need to do. So Esther does not have an appointment with the king, but she needs to go in and talk to him about this law he's passed allowing the people of the Persian Empire to kill Jews wherever they are and to seek some redress. So when Mordecai asks her to go, and Esther basically says, I can't just walk in like that. We run into these verses in chapter 4, starting in, matter of fact, let's start in verse 14. Mordecai says to her, if you keep silent this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Like God doesn't have to use you, but he's put you in a place, such a time as this, to be here. And then Mary says it, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And that's an important theological statement. I want to circle back around to in a minute. Then in verse 15, Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, the messengers between Mordecai and her. Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young woman will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. She's willing to put her life on the line. These verses are the reason Esther, to me, is such a hero. She's just a young girl who happens to be very pretty and wins a beauty contest and now ends up in the king's palace. She has access to the king. And she's willing to put her life on the line for her people. If I perish, I perish. I mean, that's some translations have, if I die, I die. These are just great verses from her. I mean, who wouldn't just want to follow in her footsteps with that kind of commitment, willing to lay down her life. Now, I want to finish out with about half a dozen theological teachings that we get from the book of Esther. The first one is the providence of God. Now, sovereignty is God's all-powerful over everything. But providence is the way God works in history, moving everything to accomplish his purpose. One of the interesting things in the book of Esther is it is the only book in the entire Bible that never mentions God. The closest we would get is Esther asking them to fast, but God's name is never mentioned anywhere. And that's important in the book of Esther because what we see is we may see God in the book of Esther more than any other book of the Bible. He's everywhere. He puts Mordecai in the right place to find the plot and be able to turn into the king and to have Haman hate Mordecai, so that all of this is passed, so that, and then Esther's in the right place, and God's made her the prettiest girl in the kingdom, uses her attractiveness to accomplish his purpose. Like all these details happen. Haman falls on Esther on the couch to beg mercy, and the king walks in at just that moment. I mean, everything in the book is God at work without ever mentioning him. And this is true in your life and mine. We should see God at work all the time, everywhere, all the time. Even when he's not mentioned, he is always there. And so this is probably the most dominant theological theme, is that God's in charge even when we don't see him. Also, the universal rule of God. This doesn't happen in Israel. This happens in Persia, one of their, probably the summer capital, which was Susa. And so God is God everywhere. He rules everything, even including pagan kingdoms. He gets the king, and all of it just ties to God's in charge of everything. A third theological principle is God and his people. Mordecai said it very clearly, didn't he? Help will rise from somewhere else. God's going to take care of his people. But perhaps it's through you, Esther. Perhaps you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So we see that God cares for his people. We see divine justice. Haman is arrogant. He wants to get rid of Mordecai in particular, and Jews beyond that, and yet he hangs on his own gallows. Obadiah 15 says, as you have done, it will be done back on you. It will return onto your own head. And so we see a sense of divine justice. We see integrity. Mordecai doesn't bow to Haman because that's a violation of what God has said. He turns in the plot even when the overturn of the king might have meant his release as a slave and the right to return back to the land, but he doesn't. He still does what's right, even when it's a difficult thing to do and may not have his own personal best interest at heart. He's a man of integrity, and so we see integrity. And then the last theological teaching is the one I think is the most significant, and that's self-sacrifice. Again, Esther, if I perish, I perish. I'm willing to sacrifice myself if this is what God has called me to do. The last thing I want to talk about is in chapter 9, verses 18 through 32. The king passes a law that allows the Jews who've been slaves to defend themselves, to take up arms. They do, and as a result, there now is the Feast of Purim. And so the book of Esther gives us the basis of the Feast of Purim, and that's all recorded in chapter 9. So I just thought I would say that as well. But I just hope that from this, one, you remember the 5 main characters of Esther: Mordecai, Ahasuerus, Haman, Vashti, and Esther. But also hope that today and tomorrow and next few days, just as you look at life, you see God's hand at work everywhere. Even when you don't see him, you see him. And you see what he's doing to accomplish his purpose. And that you would have the kind of commitment that Esther does, to be willing to say, hey, if this is what God's called me to do, great. And if I perish, I perish. So God bless you. Have a great day and a wonderful week.